This episode is brought to you by my friends at Patreon. If you'd like to join them and get early audios of upcoming episodes, please see the link in the description. Johannes Kepler was a man of singular conviction, more specifically, a singular conviction, that his life, miserable and tragic though it was the will of God. And when, in 1612, after he lost his son and wife to plague, and his job and home to civil war, he found himself a widower in the hostile city of Linz, attempting to rebuild life in a town that did not want him, he declared it the will of God that he should remarry. But Kepler was Kepler, and he did things his way. His previous marriage, arranged when he had been a penniless teacher, had been unhappy, or at least his wife had been. His decision to move to Linz, an alien town where he knew no one, had been largely to placate her, as he'd assumed she'd be happier there. Now she was dead, and he had children to support. Good Protestants of the day, men but especially women, were expected to marry, and Kepler found himself flooded with suggestions, though, as was typical for him, he struggled deciding, wavering between a total of 11 candidates. As he outlined in a wedding invitation to a certain Baron Stralendorf on October 23, 1613, though all Christians start a wedding invitation by solemnly declaring that their marriage is due to special divine management, I, as a philosopher, would like to discourse with you, O wisest of men, in greater detail about this. Was it divine providence or my own moral guilt, which, for 2 years or longer, tore me in so many different directions, and made me consider the possibilities of such different unions? If it was divine providence, to what purpose did it use those various personalities and events? For there is nothing that I would like to investigate more thoroughly, and that I more intensely long to know, than this. Can I find God, whom I can almost touch with my hands when I contemplate the universe, also in my own self? If, on the other hand, the fault was mine, in what did it consist? Cupidity, lack of judgment, or ignorance? And why, on the other hand, was there nobody among my advisers to approve of my final decision? His first option was his most obvious. A widow and a mother in a similar state to himself. Quote, "What could have seemed more reasonable than that I, as a philosopher, past the peak of virility, at an age when passion is extinct, the body dried and softened by nature, should have married a widow who would look after the household, who was known to me and my first wife, and unmistakably recommended to me by her? But if so, why did nothing come of it?" For all of Kepler's metaphysical confusion, the reason was fairly straightforward. Unfortunately, marriage at the time was about money as much as anything else, and the prospective bride had 2 daughters of marriageable age, which would make Kepler responsible for their dowries. Also, she did not control her money. Rather, it was in the hands of a trustee. Kepler continues, "Though her body was strong, it was suspect of ill health because of her stinking breath. To this came my dubious reputation in matters of religion. In addition to this, when I met the woman after everything had been settled, I had not seen her for the last 6 years, there was nothing about her that pleased me. It is therefore sufficiently clear that the matter could not succeed. But why did God permit that I should be occupied with this project, which was doomed to failure, perhaps to prevent my getting involved with other perplexities while my thoughts were on this person? I believe that things like this happen to others too, not only once but often. But the difference is that others do not worry as much as I do, that they forget more easily and get over things quicker than I do, or that they have more self-control and are less credulous than I am." An alternative was then proffered, which, for understandable reasons, somewhat skeeved Kepler out. Quote, "Together with the mother, her 2 daughters were also offered to me, under an unfavorable omen, if an offense to probity can be interpreted as such, for the project was presented by the well-wishers of the ladies in a form which was not very proper. The ugliness of this project upset me intensely, yet I began nevertheless to inquire into the conditions. As I thus transferred my interests from widows to virgins, and continued to think of the absent one, the mother, whom, so far, I had not seen, I was captivated by the appearance and pleasant features of the one who was present, that is, the daughter. Her education had been, as had been sufficiently clear, more splendid than it would be useful to me. She had been brought up in luxury that was above her station. Also, she was not of sufficient age to run a household. I decided to submit the reasons which spoke against the marriage to the judgment of the mother, who was a wise woman and loved her daughter. But it would have been better had I not done so, because the mother did not seem to be pleased. Unquote. Which, when you think about it, Mr. Kepler, isn't all that surprising. The third was an attractive young woman who, importantly for Kepler, liked his children. He left them in her care, quote, which was a rash act, as I had to fetch them back at my own expense. Unquote. Unfortunately, she had already promised herself to another. The fourth was a woman of, quote, tall stature and athletic build, which Kepler, for some reason, found objectionable. The fifth was his ultimate choice, Susanna Reutinger. An orphan 15 years his junior, she had been brought up in Cinderella-esque conditions by the Baroness Starenburg. She too loved his children, as Kepler noted. Quote, in comparing her to the fourth, the advantage was with the latter, as regards the reputation of the family, earnestness of expression, property, and dowry, but the fifth had the advantage through her love and her promise to be modest, thrifty, diligent, and to love her stepchildren. As I was turning this over, and on the point of making a decision, fate intervened. The fourth got tired of my hesitations and gave her word to another suitor, just as I had been previously annoyed about having to reject the fifth. I was now in much hurt about the loss of the fourth, that the fifth too began to lose her attraction for me. In this case, to be sure, the fault was in my feelings. Concerning the fifth, there is also the question of why, since she was destined for me, God permitted that in the course of 1 year she should have 6 more rivals. Was there no other way for my uneasy heart to be content with its fate than by realizing the impossibility of the fulfillment of so many other desires? Of the sixth, he said, quote, a certain nobility and some possessions made her desirable. On the other hand, she was not old enough, and I feared the expense of a sumptuous wedding, and her noble rank in itself made her suspect of pride. In addition, I felt pity for the fifth, who had already understood what was afoot and what had been decided. This division in me between willingness and unwillingness had, on the one hand, the advantage that it excused me in the eyes of my advisers, but on the other the disadvantage that I was as pained as if I had been rejected. But in this case, too, divine providence had meant well, because that woman would not have fitted at all with my habits and household. Of the seventh, quote, now as the fifth ruled, to my joy, alone in my heart, a fact which I also expressed to her in words, suddenly a new rival arose for her, whom I shall call number 7, because certain people, whom you know, suspected the humility of the fifth, and recommended the noble rank of the seventh. She also had an appearance which deserved to be loved. Again I was prepared to give up the fifth, and to choose the seventh, provided it was true what they said about her. But again his vacillations drove her away. Quote, and what else could have been the result but a rejection which I had quasi-provoked? Kepler entertained the eighth mainly to stop public ridicule, as she was of common origin and thus unlikely to draw public interest. But she vacillated more readily than he did, giving and then retracting her promise 7 times. Eventually, even Kepler concluded that God had sent her to him to make his decision simpler, and dropped her from consideration. Number 9, in Arthur Koestler's summation, quote, apart from lung disease, had much to recommend her, unquote. At this point, Kepler, a man who had likely never been within earshot of a lie in his entire catastrophically principled life, tried his hand at deception. He pretended to love another, hoping to draw out her true feelings. She promptly went to her mother for her blessing, but Kepler, not a dab hand at these games, thought she had rejected him. Kepler's reaction to the 10th, a noble woman of supposedly thrifty disposition, makes me wish I had a portrait to compare. Quote, "Her features were most abhorrent, and her shape ugly even for a man of simple tastes. Contrasts of our bodies was most conspicuous. I thin, dried up, and meagre, she short and fat, and coming from a family distinguished by redundant obesity. She was quite unworthy to be compared with the 5th, but this did not revive love for the latter." I mean, at least he's almost as critical of himself. The 11th and final candidate was also noble and thrifty, but was considered too young. And thus Kepler concludes, "Having thus exhausted the counsels of all my friends, I, at the last moment before my departure for Ratisbon, returned to the 5th, pledged her my word, and received hers. Now you have my commentary on my remark at the beginning of this invitation. You now see how divine providence drove me into these perplexities, that I may learn to scorn noble rank, wealth, and privilege, and parentage, of which she has none, and to seek with equanimity other, simpler virtues." The letter ends with an entreaty to the recipient, not only to attend the wedding, but by his presence soften the expected storm of public opinion that he would face. Given how surviving correspondence has painted such a painful portrait of Kepler's first marriage, that Kepler spoke hardly at all of his marriage to Susanna might suggest it was happy. So, Kepler concludes in his summation, it appears Kepler made the right choice. Except, quote, "Kepler's method of finding the right wife for himself strangely reminds one of the method of his scientific discoveries. There is the same characteristic split in the personality, between, on the one hand, the pathetically eager, Chaplin-esque figure who stumbles from one wrong hypothesis to the next, and from one candidate to another, who proceeds by trial and error, falls into grotesque traps, analyzes with pedantic seriousness each mistake, and finds in each a sign of divine providence. One could hardly imagine a more painfully humorless performance. But on the other hand, he did discover his laws, and he did make the right choice among the 11 candidates. Guided by that sleepwalking intuition which made his waking errors cancel out, and always asserted itself at the critical moment." Unquote. This is an important point as regards understanding Kepler, because this same sleepwalking intuition led to his inadvertent anticipation of several discoveries. In my previous videos on Kepler, I noted how, drawing from completely wrong assumptions, he guessed that the Sun rotated, that Mars had 2 moons, that Galileo's new planets were moons in a musical relationship, and that the Moon had a lower density than Earth, something not even Newton believed. And 400 years later, it would transpire that Kepler had, in his flailing attempts to appraise his suitors, unknowingly stumbled upon a deeper mathematical truth. In the February 1960 issue of Scientific American, in his column Mathematical Games, popular science writer and pioneering skeptic Martin Gardner outlined what would come to be called the marriage problem, or, more crassly, the secretary problem. The marriage problem is based on 6 unalterable postulates. 1. Only one suitor can win. 2. The total number of suitors is known. 3. Proposals are assessed in random order. 4. There are no ties. 5. Rejection is final. And 6. Only the best will do. The solution, according to Gardner and later formulators, is, given a finite set of applicants, the optimal probability is 1 over E. That is, Euler's number. Euler's number, like pi, is an irrational transcendental number related to a geometric structure, in this case, an exponential graph, particularly one representing compound interest. 1 over E is 37%, and the formulation demands that one reject the first 37% of suitors and then choose the first that is better than the best among the rejected. Kepler had 11 suitors. He then rejected 4, interviewed 7 more, and chose the 5th. 37% of 11 is 4, meaning that Kepler, without intending to, followed the mathematically optimal formula for choosing the perfect spouse. Kepler's intuition about the universe granted him immortality after his death. If only his intuition had granted him such aid in life, he would have been a much happier man.